For years, the U.S. dollar, well, it's been
Yeah,
the undisputed king, hasn't it? Global currency number one.
absolutely. It felt like that was just, how things were set in stone.
Exactly, an unbreakable rule.
Yeah.
But what if it's not? What if that dominance is actually fading, maybe even faster than we think?
Mm.
You're here to get informed quickly, thoroughly.
Mm.
Right. Okay, let's dive in.
Right. So today we're taking a deep dive into a pretty thought-provoking discussion. It features Arnoud Boot. He's a financial markets economist over at the University of Amsterdam.
Okay.
And his analysis, which he shared on the DNR YouTube channel, suggests, well, a surprisingly rapid shift is maybe happening in the global financial landscape, especially
Okay.
concerning the dollar's future role.
Rapid. That's the key word, isn't it? Rapid. We're not talking like a slow creep over decades here.
No, not according to him.
We're exploring these factors that point towards a really swift transition, one that could seriously lift up alternative currencies, maybe?
Mm-hmm.
And the euro seems to be popping up as a key player. And look, this isn't just dry economics. It's really about getting a handle on these big power shifts that are reshaping, well, everything.
Exactly. And Boot's main point, his central argument, is that this decline of the dollar's dominance, it isn't a slow burn, it's actually accelerating.
Accelerate. How fast are we talking?
Well, he suggests it could unfold within a pretty short time frame, maybe a few years, possibly even sooner. That sense of urgency he puts across, it's quite striking.
Wow. Okay. It really is. Now, to sort of get the groundwork here, we need a bit of history, right?
Right.
Post-World War II, the dollar just soared.
Oh, yeah. Unmatched strength. It underpinned, something like 85% of global trade back then?
Right. But the world looked totally different then. I mean, as other places developed, their economies grew.
Yeah.
Wasn't some kind of rebalancing always on the cards?
That's a really fair point, yeah. That initial huge dominance of the dollar, looking back, maybe it was a bit of an anomaly, tied to those specific post-war conditions. So yeah, the growth of other big economic centers naturally creates pressure for a more, let's say, distributed global financial system.
Yeah.
But what's really interesting here is Boot's take on how the U.S. is currently handling this shift. He uses a pretty strong word for it. He calls it a form of warfare.
Warfare. Wow. Okay, that's strong. What exactly does he point to? What actions or policies make him use that term? Is it just economic competition or is it something, more confrontational?
Well, he argues that current U.S. policy, or at least his interpretation, seems aimed against both internal dissent and the success of other nations.
Really?
Yeah, he suggests there's this mindset where if another country does well, it's seen as somehow a loss for the U.S., and that creates friction. It erodes trust, basically.
Trust.
And trust is fundamental for international cooperation. Right? And by extension, it's fundamental for the stability of the currency everyone's using.
And that lack of trust, that becomes a major driver then for moving away from the dollar. If countries feel the big player is acting unpredictably or just for itself, they'll look elsewhere.
Precisely. When the perceived upsides of sticking with the dollar are outweighed by worries about the U.S.'s actions and its reliability, well, the incentive to find alternatives just grows and grows.
He even gives a really concrete example of this sort of self-inflicted damage, doesn't he? The steel tariffs. Can you break that down? How does that illustrate his point?
Sure. So the idea behind the steel tariffs, the stated intention was to protect the U.S. steel industry.
Right.
But Boot points out that this sector is actually a pretty small slice of the overall U.S. economy, maybe like 1.5%.
Okay, 1.5%. But hang on, that steel, that's crucial input for a much, much bigger part of American industry, isn't it? Something like 80%.
Exactly. That's the core of it. So by making imported steel pricier, those tariffs ended up hiking costs for a vastly larger chunk of the economy.
Ouch. So a policy trying to help a tiny bit ends up hurting the vast majority.
That's how Boot sees it. And he argues that these kinds of policy choices, even if they're meant to fix specific domestic issues, they ripple outwards. They have these broader negative impacts on the U.S.'s economic standing and, well, ultimately on how attractive and reliable the dollar looks globally.
Okay. Now, adding another layer here, this trend of geopolitical fragmentation, we are seeing these distinct economic blocks forming, aren't we? Spheres of influence.
Yes, definitely. There's a clear trend. You see a U.S.-centric sphere kind of pulling away, maybe. And at the same time, a distinct Chinese sphere is really taking shape.
Right.
Russia is maybe another potential pole, though perhaps less defined economically.
And inside these emerging blocks, especially, say, the Chinese sphere, There's a real push for de-dollarization.
Yeah.
Boot says they're actively trying to cut their reliance on the dollar. Why? To avoid being, what is this phrase, taken hostage.
Yeah, taken hostage by U.S. policy. That's his term. And he thinks this is a central reason for the acceleration we were talking about.
Why is that fear being taken hostage such a powerful driver?
Yeah. Well, it really comes down to the fact that if you rely heavily on another nation's currency, your economy is exposed to their policies, their potential sanctions, everything.
Ah, okay. Control.
Exactly. By cutting back on dollar dependence, these countries are aiming for more economic independence, basically, less vulnerability to outside political pressure.
Which naturally leads us to, okay, so what are the alternatives then? If everyone's moving away from the dollar, where does global trade and finance go?
That is the million-dollar question, or maybe the million-euro question.
Huh, right.
So Boot does look at potential candidates. The renminbi, for instance. It's obviously more significant now, but it still faces big hurdles. Chief among them is the lack of free capital movement. Full convertibility isn't there.
Okay, so that's a limitation.
Definitely.
Yeah.
And he also touches on Japan and the yen, notes some of their ongoing economic challenges.
So the euro.
That's where his focus really shifts.
Yeah.
He sees the euro as a serious contender, a viable option to take on a much bigger role globally.
What makes the euro such a strong possibility in his eyes?
Well, think about it. The Eurozone is a massive economic bloc. It's got a relatively stable currency, established financial systems.
True.
Crucially, it doesn't have the same capital control issues as the renminbi. And it already enjoys a fair degree of international trust and acceptance.
Okay, makes sense.
Now, this brings up an interesting point about how fast this could all happen. A fundamental shift in global currency use. That doesn't happen overnight, obviously.
Right, it takes time.
But Boot really stresses that a time frame of, say, 3-4 years, in the grand scheme of global finance, that's actually pretty short. It demands attention now.
3 to 4 years.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's not long at all in these terms. So we get why it might happen and what the alternatives are, but what about the timeline itself? What could speed this up or slow it down within that window?
Good question. Well, factors that might accelerate it. Things like more perceived missteps in U.S. policy, maybe. Greater momentum behind alternative payment systems.
Like digital currencies or other cross-border things.
Exactly. Transactions in other currencies. And also a deliberate push by, say, the Eurozone to really boost the Euro's international profile.
Okay. And slowing it down.
Conversely, maybe a renewed U.S. focus on international cooperation, more predictable policy, that could potentially tap the brakes on de-dollarization.
So this really looks like a big opportunity for Europe, doesn't it? A chance to actively position the euro as a top global reserve currency.
It does, but Boot also throws in a really interesting question about ambition. Is simply swapping one dominant currency for another actually the best outcome?
Ah, so not just replacing the dollar king with the euro king.
Right. He kind of questions if that should be Europe's main goal, because that kind of dominance, whoever holds it, can create its own problems, its own tensions in the global system.
That's a fair point. So what's the alternative vision then?
Well, this leads him to this fascinating idea of a multipolar currency world.
Multipolar, yeah.
He pictures a future where maybe, 5 or so generally accepted currencies coexist, each playing a major role.
5 currencies. How would that even work? Wouldn't it be chaos?
Well, he suggests that with modern technology, think about getting real-time exchange rate info instantly. It might not be that disruptive. He seems to think it's a less problematic scenario than just one currency calling all the shots.
A more distributed system.
Yeah.
What stands out to you about that vision?
What's really interesting is that idea of spreading the risk, not being so reliant on a single point of failure or control. A multipolar world, if exchanges are efficient, could maybe foster more stability, more resilience, less systemic risk tied to just one currency's fate.
Okay, now let's flip back to the U.S. perspective.
Yeah.
If the dollar's global dominance does shrink, what does the U.S. actually lose? Boot calls it a privilege. What does that mean exactly?
Yeah, the exorbitant privilege, as it's sometimes called. Historically, the U.S. has benefited hugely from the dollar being the world's main currency. Well, first, it creates this constant global demand for dollars. Countries need to hold dollar reserves for trade, for finance. Second, during shaky economic times globally, the dollar has usually been the safe haven. Capital flows into the U.S.
Right, so this privilege, it basically let the U.S. run big deficits, spend more, because they knew the world would keep buying U.S. bonds, a sort of built-in advantage.
Precisely. That inherent advantage, that almost guaranteed global appetite for dollar assets, that gets weaker. Significantly weaker, potentially, as the dollar's central role fades and it's maybe not seen as the automatic safe place to park money anymore.
Okay, so wrapping this all up,
Hmm.
the main takeaway seems to be this VIX of factors, U.S. policy choices, the rise of other economic powers. They're really speeding up this move away from the dollar's long reign.
Yeah. And it could very well clear the path for a more multipolar currency world, with the euro, as we discussed, looking like a pretty strong contender in whatever new system emerges.
Which leads to a really crucial question for you, the listener. Thinking about these potential huge shifts, what does this mean for individuals, for businesses, for the whole global economic order that we've kind of gotten used to?
Mm-hmm. What are those long-term ripple effects likely to be? It's definitely something to ponder.
Absolutely. This deep dive into Arno Boot's analysis, it really gives a compelling look at a potentially massive transformation. Understanding these forces, well,
Yeah.
it's going to be vital for navigating whatever comes next. Thanks for joining us.